Hi, I'm Reed Leiting, a veterinarian with Perfectus, and I'm here today with Brian Dorcey, another veterinarian with Perfectus Livestock Solutions. Today we're going to talk about um, some of the health programs starting these beef on dairy calves.
So Reed and I work together with multiple farms across the country, starting beef on dairy calves, all the way from day one to finish, and at different stages along the way. So the beef on dairy system segments nicely into a wet calf system, kind of that grower backgrounder, and then kind of onto the finish.
So as we talk about these calves coming out of barns, they went in coming from multiple sources. They've been exposed to a lot of different cross diseases. What do you see as important in those calves as they come out of barns or come out of systems where they're now maybe 500 pounds and they've been commingled?
Yeah, I think there's a number of opportunities when they show up at a farm at 500 pounds. One is to correct some of the issues that may have happened in that backgrounding phase from, let's just say, 200 to 500 pounds. Some is catching up, and where sometimes metaphylaxis makes sense on
Yeah.
those. Not all the time, but it's easier if we, as veterinarians, know the flow all the way, whether that's all the way through the backgrounding phase or all the way back to the wet calf. But sometimes when we don't have any previous knowledge on those
hmm
calves, metaphylaxis makes sense. So usually it's going to be a Draxin kind of a tulithromycin compound
hmm
that makes the most sense for those calves because it it helps it addresses pathogens like Mycoplasma, Pasteurella, Mannheimia, and Histophilus all really well. So
Yeah.
lots of the guys that we'll deal with will start with a metaphylaxis on arrival at that 500 pounds if they don't have any previous history on those.
I mean, it's not uncommon to see lots of different organisms. As we've done deep nasal pharyngeal
Yeah.
swabs, we get the four that you mentioned. We get some viruses, influenza D and corona, that kind of thing. So, if you know your flow, it's certainly helpful
Yeah.
to do that. What antigens are important to cover from a vaccine standpoint? Some we can easily, some are more difficult. What's the program that you'd like to see?
Yeah, I think the ones that we really got to do a good job first and foremost is the viruses. So picking a strong five-way up front, one that's going to hold up in a feedlot situation, which is what those calves are
Mhm.
transitioning to, is to a feedlot. So picking a quality five-way, I think, is your kind of first step in that. And then I think we've got to correct for some of the variability of exposure that might have
Mhm.
gone on through that previous step. So I think, as you and I look at these nasal swabs, we find a ton of mycoplasma,
Yep.
find a ton of Histophilus, and those are the toughest ones to
Yep.
fight,
Two
right?
biggies right there.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yep. So I think addressing those with a really strong vaccine that's got some good science behind it is super important. And then you kind of get into your Pasteurellas, Mannheimias, which generally don't see a lot of genetic variability, right? And so
Right.
they tend to be pretty homogenous through the whole cattle population. So I think having a vaccine in there that addresses those, or combination of vaccines that address those, is super important. And so those are the two vaccines that I would lean on. And then you kind of get into your coronas, influenzas, some of those other kind of somewhat oddballs, less prevalent viruses that we see as part of that respiratory complex.
No, certainly not as common, but they can rear their ugly head. All the bacteria, as you mentioned, very good at piling on to situations where maybe nutrition is different, they're moving to a new facility, that kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
and all the more reason to from where we stand, have the balanced amino acid type diets, and a good rumen makes for a healthier respiratory system.
Yeah, that's been the cool thing is we've started these calves on a amino acid balanced diet. Some of that transition distress that comes from the digestive tract just isn't there.
Yeah.
And so, cattle can handle stress if it comes at them slowly. But as we take that dietary stress, it allows them to concentrate on the antigens, the pathogens that are in the respiratory tract. So there's not this piling on effect. So yeah, that's been cool for me to see as a veterinarian,
Yeah, I would have
being part of
never
that.
believed that probably 3 or 4 years ago that making the rumen healthy makes for less respiratory disease. But we get that from people all the time.
Yeah, yep. I
Mhm.
think the way that the nutritionists formulate for that to reduce some of that starch that gets into the hind gut and balances that amino acid to, it's just a healthier digestive tract. And if we can keep that digestive tract healthy, it doesn't irritate the pneumonia or irritate the lungs and then cause some of those bacteria that are lurking in there that may be a secondary to pile on. Yep.
If you're going to do metaphylaxis and vaccination programs, how quick after calves come in should they be done?
I usually try to rest the calves for a day or two. So my rule of thumb is for every hour on the truck, I want an hour, 2 hours of rest. So generally these calves, they can be trucked various degrees of distance, but that does make a difference. So we want those calves to get that shrink back in that 24, 48 hours. So we try to rest them.
Yep. How do you handle parasiticides in these calves? It's a little different environment than our
Right.
colored cattle coming off of grass.
Yeah. Yeah. These calves have never really been out in a situation where they'd be exposed to parasites. You'll pick up some background barnyard parasites, but none that have ever been shown to be economically impactful. So generally, we don't do a whole lot for parasiticides. They may see a white wormer somewhere along the way, but we don't have to get super aggressive because they've never grazed.
Yeah. External and internal parasites both, really.
Right. Right. And we will get some, if you know the history, that they will put on grass every now and then, kind of southern Missouri kind of a deal every now and then,
Right.
which generally they'll come with a parasite load, but that's after the fact. I would say 99% don't have a measurable parasite load. But I would say the one thing that we've got to concentrate on is coccidiosis.
Yes.
So I think getting a coccidiostat in those guys early is super important because that cocci just impacts that respiratory health through digestive distress, like we talked about before. So.
Yeah, even coming out of these barns, they've been on rumensin generally. They've been on something that's been trying to control coccidia because they just get exposed along the way.
Yep. We've got a number of farms that are the ones that are specific about controlling that coccidiosis have less respiratory trouble.
So these calves can come out of a lot of different situations. We see calves coming in that are relatively light, maybe 150. We see others coming in at 220. They've been raised in a lot of different situations. How do you manage those multiple kinds of situations within this backgrounded calf or post milk calf?
Yeah, that calf coming in at 220 pounds, that 8 to 10 week old calf is a challenge because a couple things. We're asking him to change his diet. It's been on milk and highly concentrated feeds for a long time. Lots of times farms are trying to get them on some sort of on-farm feed stuff. But I don't think we want to rush that transition. I think the longer we keep them on something that mimics what they came from is super important because it's a little more expensive, but if you amortize that cost of that short phase of production across that calf's life, it's a rounding error in your closeout generally. But they're not truly a ruminant at that point. Right. So we got to transition them, and they don't really become a ruminant until they're 350 to 450 pounds. So we've really got to walk slowly on that. So we've not only got the commingle issue that goes on because lots of times they're raised in a hut or may have been together as a group. We've got to swap spit on that group and circulate the pathogens so that we can start to develop some herd immunity, but also go slowly with the dietary transitions. And that's the other place that the amino acid diet and the balance that the guys do just impresses the heck out of me because they just they handle the commingle better that way without that dietary stress. And they're in a positive energy balance.
Yep. I think sometimes we think of, it is a more expensive diet, but we see some of these closeouts coming out of these barns that are 2.8, 2.9, 3.0 feed conversions. And when you get back to what the cost of gain is, it's not probably as expensive a diet as what we think of even with a TMR that maybe has a poor feed conversion.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And that's the conversation that I have with a lot of farms that I go to is, oh, doc, that's so expensive. But yeah, it's your sort of calves. And so is death loss. And so are the out cattle. Everybody knows kind of what the death loss is, but not many people account for the out cattle. And kind of the 11th commandment of feedlot medicine is your deads equal your outs, right? And so if you've got a percent of death loss, you generally are going to have a percent of non-full value calves that you got to deal with and account for and find a home for and manage differently. So I think going slow, spending a little more money in that delicate stage from 220 to 550 pays off when they're 1250 to 1450.
Yeah. One of the things been surprised about, especially in these hog barns, is maybe the need for sorting calves. I think sometimes we think about putting calves away, and they're going to stay in their pens, and everybody's going to do great. But sometimes this is the first time they've been commingled,
Yeah.
and to get all of our timid calves in a pen when they start falling behind, and being willing to handle those, do as much sorting and that kind of thing as you can on arrival, but not being afraid to gather up some of those calves and give them maybe a little easier chance.
Yeah, that's been a big deal. And, it's been fun as they've gone into some of these converted hog barns, you can really manage those down to a tighter group. And lots of times I walk through a yard and just say, we got to get the bigs on one side. And so it's a one split, right? And
Right.
so bigs on this side, smalls on that side, just because those bullies, especially if we don't have adequate bunk space or whatever, or we don't have enough capacity for everybody to get there at the same time, those bullies will overeat, and then the other ones undereat, and then our bigs get bigger and our smalls get smaller.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, when we bunch up these calves in the hog barns, you get all the timid ones in a pen, they do pretty well.
yeah,
But man, they just can't compete against those ones that are big bullies.
yeah. And if we're receiving those 220-pound calves, lots of times to take out some of that variability, we're having pretty substantial conversations with the calf ranch and the calf ranch's buyer to make sure that our specs, when that buyer's buying for the calf ranch, and then the sort as they're going through the calf ranch, also pays off for the backgrounder that then has to manage those further on. So
yeah, what you buy makes the difference.
Yep, garbage in, garbage out, and yeah. So some of the biggest problems are the ones that cheapen up the load, right? They're the whole back big calf, or they're the tag along small calf, and they're hard for most feeders to manage.
Correct. Yeah.
So, I think that's a good way to wrap up our conversation on these beef on dairy calves. And so, as folks have questions about this, reach out to any of the veterinarians at Perfectus Livestock Solutions, any of the sales folks, and we're happy to help, and follow along on our social media.